Okay, this is going to be part 2 of Unit 4, and we're still talking about slavery and how it refers to the South. Today, this section I want to talk about what it's like to be a slave down here in the South. And the first thing I want you to understand is that every situation is going to be different. You can't make a lot of generalizations because it's going to depend a lot on the masters, and it's going to depend a lot on what region you are. If you live in a city or you live on a farm, these kinds of things. So every situation is going to be different. We have the idea in our head that slaves all lived on these huge plantations with hundreds of others of slaves, and they were constantly whipped and brutalized and these kinds of things, and that those did happen, and those are horrible things, but each slave situation is going to be different. Don't make generalizations. It's going to depend a lot on where you are in your how unique your situation is, because each situation is going to be fairly different. In class we're reading Frederick Douglass's autobiography, and we're going to read a couple other things and see some videos that kind of get more of a sense of this, but some things that I want you to know about what it was like as a slave. Let's go through just a few things. Okay, some constants were, again, you're going to be doing hard physical labor for most part. Most slaves, of course, were hired to work in cotton fields, and so you're doing hard physical labor. Some exceptions to that are going to be, if you're a domestic servant, you're a laundress, you cook meals, you clean. Sometimes when you're older, you rear children. When slaves got older, sometimes too, they were work in the workshops, like the blacksmith shop or the wood shop, those kinds of things. But most of the slaves, again, are hired to work in the fields to plant and harvest cotton, and so that's mostly what you're going to do. And you're also going to have really no rights whatsoever. For the most part, you're seen as property, and property doesn't have rights. The only people that have rights are the people that own the property. And a lot of that you'll see in things like black codes. Again, you might remember that from our earlier discussions, that really limited the freedom of the blacks. These blacks were not allowed to move around freely, weren't allowed to read and write, they weren't allowed to marry without permission, these kinds of things. Pretty much your whole daily routine was determined for you, and you didn't have a lot of rights, and you were seen, again, as a thing, as property. The work, again, is going to be long hours. You're going to be working from what they called can see to can't see, which is when the sun is up, you are out in the fields. Not getting up, you're out there. So as soon as the sun is up, you're at work. So we're talking, you can imagine in the summer, we're talking 14-hour days, pretty easy there. 5:30 to 8 o'clock at night or something along those lines. A few breaks in between, but you're in for a hard physical day. Another constant is pretty often, most of the time, you're treated fairly well. Again, because these are property, you don't usually destroy your property. And this property was very, very valuable. The only thing that was more valuable than slaves was the land that produced the cotton. But without slaves, you don't have the cotton, you don't have the harvest, you can't pay your bills, you can't move up that social ladder, you can't get more and more money and more power. So slaves were very important. So pretty much you're treated fairly well. You're not going to be beaten on a constant basis. The only time beatings would occur is if someone was caught running away or trying to plan some sort of slave revolt or cause trouble, or sometimes they needed to make an example for whatever reason. So you're treated fairly well. They're going to basically want you to work. They're going to leave you alone for the most part. But again, remember, some people are cruel, and so some masters would be more cruel than others. Another fairly constant is you're living in a very simple dwelling. It's not going to be well constructed. You're going to be exposed to the elements quite a bit. You're not going to have the warmest of clothes, and you're certainly not going to have any more food than you need to keep you going. Hunger was a pretty constant thing. There's no such things, as having seconds, and those. You're going to have just enough to keep you going, so that you can work. But you're constantly going to be kind of, I could eat a little more. I could do with a little bit more. Sometimes slaves were allowed to plant little gardens around their dwelling, and again, sometimes they weren't. But that's about the only way they got extra food. These are fairly constant conditions of being a slave. One of the worst parts about being a slave, if you listen to slave narratives, is how families were torn apart, which was called being sold down the river. That's being down the river. They transported you, further and further west. You might remember that that's the direction that cotton is going. But often slaves were traded, like you and I might sell cars today. Well, we want a new model, or somebody wants this car for their child, so they sell slaves in much the same fashion. And oftentimes it's when slaves would get close to their 18th birthday or something along those lines, they would be sold to someone. Sometimes slaves were sold to pay off debts. Sometimes slaves were gambled and lost in card games for various reasons. But a constant for most slaves is that your family is going to be usually torn apart. You're not going to have your children with you. Sometimes even wives and husbands are separated. But generally children are separated from their parents, again, around the age 18, but could be any time. A lot of times students, say, well, why didn't slaves do more to revolt or to, do something against this institution? Why did they seem so passive? And that's generally, not the case. Slaves were actively resisting slavery as best they could. Now, as you can see on the board, slave revolts themselves are pretty rare. Some of the more famous ones that take place during this time are Vesey and certainly the Nat Turner Rebellion, which was very, very violent. The most violent of all of them. They killed 50, 60 white people, and that really scared whites down south. They really, lashed out then at the blacks to kind of make an example of them. But slave revolts are pretty rare because the chance of success is really low. For example, where are you going to go? You revolt, okay, you're on the run. Where are you going to go? The whole South is white. They know if you're black, you're probably a slave. They're going to be hunting for you. How are you going to go somewhere? How is the situation going to change? How are you going to fight them? They usually have guns more than you. They have the law on their side. They'll often have the state militias on their side. So the deck is really stacked against you. So revolts themselves, actually military revolts, are fairly infrequent and not real common. And usually when they do happen, it's really bad for those that didn't revolt, as there's a huge backlash against all slaves, as they're trying to make an example of them, to try to put the fear in people to not let it happen again. And the threat was so real oftentimes because white people were often outnumbered by the slaves in a certain county or area, and so they knew if slaves revolted that it would good chance to result in death of a good portion of the whites until it got put under control. So they were constantly on the lookout for that and constantly punishing anybody that might be up to something like that. So revolts are really rare. More and more common was escape. That was the much more common and preferred method because your chance of success was higher. You had, as you can see on the board, you had groups like the Underground Railroad assisting you, and I know you guys know what that is. It's, there was a series of stops on the way from the south to the north where black people could find shelter and help to get further north to freedom, where a lot of the states had outlawed slavery. And many of these guys actually escaped and went to Canada eventually too. This was difficult. This was a hard journey, but chance of success was much, much greater. Usually this was in small groups, oftentimes just one or two people, and you could move faster. And with the help of the Underground Railroad, I'm sure you guys are familiar with like Harriet Tubman, a former slave who supposedly helped thousands, hundreds if not thousands of slaves escape to the north. This was just a lot easier, and again, this might be why your family are torn apart as well, is the children or the males, most more likely for males to run away than females. This could tear your family apart as well. But this was much more common. And other things they did to resist, and those that stayed on the reservation, they resisted too. Other things they did were they often would try to work as slow as possible, as slow as they could without getting into trouble, so it would screw up the schedule, and they would break equipment, these kind of things. They would fake sickness, anything. Sometimes they would run away for a couple days when they were just really tired and overworked and couldn't handle being in the sun anymore. They would run away and then come back. they would do these types of resistance because this is something they could do and then survive. This is something they could do, and the punishments would be less severe, but they still were trying to resist as much as they could. It wasn't a passive thing. They were actively resisting, but again, the deck was so stacked in their favor. It's like that, not that they could form an army and revolt and then find happiness someplace else. These guys were really kind of stuck where they were, and they resisted as best they could. As far as slave culture goes, in the 1800s, by that time most slaves had been born here. So you don't have the African heritage that you did with earlier slaves. You don't have the different languages. These people are speaking English. They have our customs and our way of life. So they're more similar to the people in America than they are to Africa. So you get rid of a lot of some of that traditional music and tribal dance that held them together, early African slaves together before. That's pretty much gone by the mid-1800s. Something that really changed African culture for slaves was the Second Great Awakening, which we should know is, again, another big religious revival effort. We're bringing people back to religion, and part of this time was converting blacks. Many blacks were converted at this time to Christianity. So again, they're becoming more and more like the people that are enslaving them and less like those people in Africa. In the Second Great Awakening, there was a big movement to convert blacks to Christianity, to save their souls, because that's a lot of what the Great Awakening was converting people and saving people and getting them to heaven and changing the evils of the world that you see. And so part of that would be to help those that don't know about God learn about Him so they could be His children well. And many blacks were converted. One of the things that students are surprised to know that this means that many blacks and whites would go to the same churches. Blacks were not allowed to have their own separate churches for fear of, that's where they would plan things. That's where they would start revolts. That's where they would teach each other how to read and write, which would give them ideas. So blacks and whites then would go to church together, and Christianity became an important part of the culture of blacks because it really appealed to them, this whole thing about life after death and being saved because we had a harsh life on earth. Those are kind of things that are really going to appeal to the blacks because they're suffering, and the Bible talks a lot of those people that are suffering will find happiness and peace in the life hereafter. Those things sound pretty good to them. And when you listen to the black spirituals, which were a very constant part of their life at this time, that's what the spirituals are about. It's about life after death in the days that are to come, a heaven being a place where every tear is wiped away. And blacks really cling to that, and they need that to kind of give them the hope to kind of keep them going. And spirituals become kind of the replacement for the African music that they had before. They still dance, and they still have some of that African heritage that is passed on from generation to generation, but it's more based around Christian ideals now than anything else. And again, those are stressful or important to them. Black spirituals really help them go through this difficult period in their life. And then the other thing that's really important is family life. Especially your extended family, because your nuclear family or immediate family might be ripped apart. So your grandmothers, your aunts and uncles are all going to be very important to you. What's really important about your family life is this is the people that look out for you. These are the people that educate you about what it's like to be a slave. These are the danger signs you've got to watch out for, and they help you in times of trouble. So oftentimes these older slaves, like your uncle or your grandmother, might have connections with the master that might save you from being sold or being punished too harshly. And so these family connections and these family units were very important because that's all they had. This is the only thing they had as far as education. It's the only thing they had as far as any kind of support in most cases. Again, keep in mind the theme is each slave's situation is going to be a little different. But for most slaves, they didn't have anything else except this extended family, and that was very important to them. That kept them going in these times of trouble. And that ends Part 2 of Unit 4.